The setup time is over and we've finally reached the good stuff. All of the challenges and pain and suffering Ubbe faced on his journey to reach the Golden Land came to an end. Ivar, after so long, is finally back in England and fighting Saxons and doing cool shit. And after 17 episodes of Zero Alfred, he's finally back on the screen. Now before we return to England, I thought it would be interesting to go back and look where we left off. In Season 5, Björn, Lagertha and Ubbe were sent running by Ivar as he takes Kattegat. They flee to England and make a deal with Alfred to be able to stay there if they help him defend Wessex, similar to the kind of deal that Rollo made in Francia. And soon enough, Harald does arrive with his armies, and Björn helps Alfred and the Wessex forces to prevail in that battle. In that time, Ubbe actually became quite close with Alfred and they made quite strong ties. But Björn himself never really fully brought into the agreement and was only doing it to kind of get by. Even though Alfred manages to win this battle and prove himself victorious, he still falls ill regularly, and this makes a lot of the noblemen feel very anxious about keeping him as king. We see them trying to plot with his brother Ethelred, as they feel he's a more reliable heir and someone that will have their interests. This leads to Judith, the mother of both Alfred and Ethelred, to kill her own son Ethelred by poisoning him to make sure that Alfred doesn't have any challenge to his throne. Which is a pretty brutal and cruel thing to do, especially when you're someone's mother, but it did work in consolidating rule and power to Alfred. And the last major event we get in England before we don't see them for a while is actually Judith dying to cancer herself. So we pick back up in England after quite some time with Alfred attending a church service. Even though there hasn't been a great Viking army returned to their shores in quite some time, the memory of that invasion and the threat of it happening again has not left people's minds. And it's pretty hard for them to forget because Wessex is really the only kingdom that's actually independent, the rest having to deal with some level of Danes and Vikings in their territory settling or controlling their kingdoms. But even so, it seems that Wessex is in a time of peace, much like Kattegat. They even give us a scene where Alfred is kind of lounging around with his lords having a picnic outside when the news of the Viking ships being spotted comes to him. And if your king can have time to lounge around and do that, especially the workaholic that is Alfred, then it's probably not unreasonable to presume that Wessex has done fairly well in the time span since we've seen it. Vikings very quickly reminds us that Alfred has a different way of seeing problems. He always tries to go for the most logical and practical approaches, even when that approach leads to decisions that might be seen in a bad light. Unlike the soldier who is out of breath and afraid when he brings the news, unlike the shocked expressions of his commanders and generals when they discover they have to abandon their home, and unlike the frustration and anger from her wife from facing the same problems and people over and over, he is always very calm, very rational, very put together. By no means is this to say that he's some cold robot or inhuman calculating general. He is very pious, he is very caring, but his faith and his beliefs are far more immaterial than the actual places and things themselves. So I thought Vikings did very well in these few short scenes to catch us up on Alfred, how he thinks, what his plan is going to be, and what we can expect from him for the rest of the season. So things are getting truly desperate on this boat in the middle of nowhere. Ubbe is at the point where he's squeezing out water from ropes on the ship just to get a few more drops of moisture for his kid. Virtually everyone on the ship is starting to look more like a lifeless corpse, which is not exactly what you picture when you think of these romantic ideas of Viking adventurers finding new places in far-flung parts of the world. So as Ubbe continues his mindless routine of staring away into the distance, he finally sees something a little different, and through his cracked and raspy voice calls out to Torvi. After all this time, all the suffering that not only they've faced, but we have had to go through as well, because damn, this was hard scenes to get through, they have finally arrived at the Golden Land, the promise that Odir sold them all on. They don't know whether they should be crying or laughing, they are just so happy that they finally have change. And even though Ubbe and Odir have been throwing these glares at each other and their tension has been building up over this entire time, the sheer joy of the truth being revealed, of them finding the land they've been searching for, overcomes that hostility. So we pan out with the view of the island in the background and the dilapidated ship in front as the passengers look on at their new future and new journey. Because in reality their story's only just started, the work begins now. And I cannot wait to see the challenges they face and how they overcome them. So Ivar and Harold's forces arrive in England and they begin to plan how they're going to take down Wessex. Ivar's never been the one who likes to take his enemies head on, so he puts out an idea to draw their forces to a place of their choosing. But the interesting thing to me was how Ivar's proposal weaved in this so-called experience he had with Ragnar during their travels of England right before his death. In my last review, one of you mentioned that Ivar keeps referencing Ragnar and using his name to give himself leverage and influence. When I scoured through season 4 and those scenes we had between the two of them before they got separated, it was clear that Ragnar never did tell him about this area. Now maybe the showrunners wanted to imply a scene that happened off screen, but it also could just as easily be Ivar just lying to get people to go with his ideas, putting him in a better position to command this army. I'm sure it's no coincidence the very next scene is the one where Harold's bathing, and Ivar not too discreetly to Hvitserk implies that his days are numbered. At the bare minimum, Ivar's planning and plotting some sort of aggression against Harald to make himself the central Viking in this force. He's trying to make himself seem useful and competent, and most people were just kind of going with the flow, underestimating his true ambition. So as Ivar and Hvitserk head out to try and get some information about what Alfred's moves are, we get the first serious skirmish between the two forces. We saw that the men had laid a trap with a deer that was pinned to the ground and had it in ambush waiting. And on top of that, the Saxon commander was shouting for them to target Ivar specifically. And it was a pretty brutal battle that got Ivar very close to the action, having to cut down a couple of the men himself, and so they weren't too far away from achieving that goal. Right before the fight broke out, we cut across between Alfred praying and the prelude to this engagement. So they could be implying that Alfred had a very direct role in setting up this ambush. It's possible he believes if he kills the sons of Ragnar, it will demoralize his forces. By taking out their commanders and the famous names of the force, it could lead to them being disbanded and having to avoid a fight in the first place. But they never did manage to pull it off because Hvitserk came in with his axe swinging. It's hard to think that only last episode he was crying with self-pity. It seemed from the gestures we got and the few little murmurings that Ivar intentionally made himself vulnerable and a target and hid Hvitserk's forces somewhere nearby so they could come in and save the day. And the Saxons fell right for it. So with their first obstacle out of the way, they have free reign to burn as they see fit. Ivar wants to antagonize and torment the population so that Alfred feels compelled to face him in a place that Ivar has the advantage. As long as Harold's forces are unleashed on this land, burning down farms and sending the people as refugees, the unrest will build more and more, demanding the King of Wessex does something about it. So his army sits up in the location that Ivar suggested, looking for an opportunity to spot Alfred's forces and take them out. And at the same time, Ivar very much seems to be looking out for an opportunity to do the same to Harald. So it very much seems, even with a common purpose, the infighting will never stop. One of the highlights for this episode had to be when Harald was explaining Floki's history to Eric and Ingrid. In the scene, he almost sounded like a grandfather giving his war stories to the grandson who didn't really understand the references of the people he was mentioning. We know that the golden age of Vikings has been kind of pushing on and the stories of Ragnar and Floki and his companions are fading, but to see this new generation of characters not get the references really breaks our heart. Like, I remember when Harald was the new face himself, but now he seems like an ancient character in the series. And I also hope that the mentioning of Floki means that in the Ubbe storyline we'll get some progression on that as well. They left things so inconclusive when we last saw Floki getting buried in that mountain, and I just refuse to accept that to be the end of his story. Now Harald knows that Ingrid and Eric both don't like him and only use him because of his power and position. And so as he's leaving on what could be a one-way trip to England to enjoy his last days as a Viking, he decides to mess with both of them on the way out. He knows by making them both co-rulers they're gonna torture and infight amongst each other until they both hate their lives. So far the shit show's been one-sided because of the witch, but I imagine it's gonna fall to pieces altogether by the end. But to be perfectly honest, no matter what really happens in Kattegat, it's not really that interesting compared to what's happening in England. So for the most part, we've kind of just like skimming through it while we get to the good stuff. So as a whole, I really enjoyed this episode. I've loved the fighting, I've loved the expansion in England. As expected, having Alfred back's been a blast, so I cannot wait to see how much this develops in the next 3 episodes and where this phenomenal series will end. Stay tuned for episode 18.